Hi, I'm Andrew, and I'm 65 years old. You know, for most of my life, I've held on to one belief: loyalty. It's something my parents taught me early on. Loyalty to your family, to your friends, but most importantly, to your spouse. I've always believed that if you're loyal to the people you love, everything else will fall into place. I've been married to Anna for over 40 years. We met when we were both in our 20s, and it felt like a fairy tale. We built a life together, raised our kids, went through the highs and lows, and I always thought we were solid. I always thought we had something unbreakable. I've spent years dreaming about our future together, growing old side by side, watching our grandchildren play, living out that classic picture of a happy, retired couple. That's what I wanted, and that's what I believed we'd have. But if I'm honest, there was always a small fear in the back of my mind. A fear I didn't like to think about. What if Anna wasn't as loyal as I thought? What if everything we had built together could be shattered? I'd push those thoughts away because they didn't fit into the life I wanted to believe we had. I told myself, not Anna. She wouldn't do that. She's different. She's loyal. I held on to that belief like a lifeline. Because really, what else could I do? When you've spent decades with someone, you have to trust that they're as committed as you are, right? But the thing about beliefs is, they're fragile, especially when they're based on trust. And as much as I wanted to believe in Anna and in the life we built together, I started to realize that sometimes life has a way of throwing curveballs you never saw coming. So what do you do when everything you thought you knew starts to fall apart? When the person you've shared your life with suddenly isn't who you thought they were? That's what I had to figure out, and it wasn't easy. It was an ordinary day when everything changed. I remember it so clearly because, honestly, it's one of those moments you don't forget. I was out in the yard doing some light gardening when my neighbor, John, walked over. He had this look on his face, like he didn't really want to be there, but he felt like he had to say something. John and I had known each other for years, so when he said, "Andrew, I need to talk to you about something," I figured it was just going to be about the usual neighborhood stuff. But then he hesitated, and that's when I knew it wasn't anything ordinary. He started by saying he wasn't sure if he should even be telling me this, but he felt like I needed to know. My heart was already starting to race. You know that feeling when you just know bad news is coming? That's what it was like. John told me that he had seen Anna around town more than once with another man. He didn't have all the details, but what he did know was enough to make me feel like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. He wasn't just talking about some casual conversation. He was talking about them looking close, too close. At first, I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't believe it. Not Anna, not the woman I've been married to for over 40 years. It felt surreal, like something out of a bad dream. I even asked him, "Are you sure it was Anna? Maybe you're mistaken." But John was sure. He'd seen them more than once, and there was no mistaking it. That's when the disbelief started to mix with something else. Anger. Anger at John for telling me, anger at myself for even considering it could be true, and most of all, a deep, unsettling anger at Anna. How could she do this to me, to us? But then just as quickly, the anger faded and was replaced by confusion and fear. I didn't know what to do with this information. Do I confront her? Do I ignore it and hope it's all a big misunderstanding? My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. The worst part was that I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with him. I started questioning everything. every moment we'd spent together, every word she'd said to me. Was any of it real? Or had I been living a lie all these years? My belief in our marriage, in her loyalty, was starting to crack. And once that crack appeared, it felt like it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't ignore it either. The more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me until I knew I had to do something, even if I wasn't sure what that something was. After hearing what John had told me, I felt like I was living in a fog. My mind was constantly racing, replaying everything he said over and over again. It's strange how, in a moment like that, time seems to stretch and contract at the same time. Days passed, but I felt stuck in that one moment, unable to move forward. And that's when the self-doubt started to creep in. I started questioning everything about myself. Was I not good enough? Had I failed as a husband? I looked at myself in the mirror and saw a man who was older, grayer, maybe a little heavier than he used to be. I wondered if that was it. Had I become less attractive, less desirable? Was that why Anna had turned to someone else? I couldn't help but think back to all the times I had tried to be the best husband I could be. I worked hard to provide for us, made sacrifices to keep our family together, and always put her needs before mine. But now, all of that felt meaningless. It felt like no matter what I had done, it wasn't enough to keep her by my side. And then, there was this overwhelming sense of shame. I felt embarrassed, like I had been made a fool of. I wondered if everyone else knew, if they had been talking about us behind our backs. The thought that others might have seen what I didn't, that they might have known about the affair while I remained clueless, was almost too much to bear. I also started to question the kind of man I was. I used to think I was strong, dependable, someone who could weather any storm. But now, I felt weak, broken. I had spent so much of my life believing that loyalty was everything, and now it felt like that belief had been shattered. I remember lying awake at night, unable to sleep, just staring at the ceiling, and wondering how things had come to this. How had I missed the signs? Or were there even signs to miss? Maybe I had been so caught up in believing that everything was fine, that I couldn't see what was happening right in front of me. The pain of betrayal wasn't just about what Anna had done. It was about how it made me feel about myself. I felt like I had failed, not just in my marriage, but as a person. The confidence I once had was gone, replaced by this nagging sense of inadequacy. It felt like a part of me had been ripped away, leaving behind an empty space that I didn't know how to fill. And the worst part was, I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know if I could ever feel whole again. After days of tormenting myself, I knew I couldn't go on like this. I needed answers, even if I wasn't sure I was ready to hear them. So, one evening, I decided it was time to confront Anna. My heart was pounding in my chest as I sat down at the kitchen table, waiting for her to come home. I felt a mix of fear, anger, and desperation, all swirling together, making it hard to think straight. When she walked through the door, I could barely look at her. But I knew I had to do this. I had to know the truth. So I took a deep breath and asked her to sit down. She must have sensed that something was wrong, because she looked at me with concern and asked if everything was okay. I didn't want to beat around the bush, so I just came out with it. "Anna," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Have you been seeing someone else?" There was a moment of silence that felt like it lasted forever. She just stared at me, and I could see the shock in her eyes. At first, she didn't say anything, but then she started shaking her head, almost as if she couldn't believe what I was asking. "What are you talking about, Andrew?" she finally said, her voice trembling. But I couldn't stop now. "John told me he saw you with another man," I continued, my voice rising with the flood of emotions I'd been holding back. "He said you looked close." That's when I saw it. The flicker of recognition in her eyes, the slight change in her expression that told me everything I needed to know. She tried to deny it at first, telling me that John must have been mistaken, that it was just a friend, nothing more. But the more I pressed, the more her defenses started to crumble. Finally, she looked down at her hands, unable to meet my eyes, and that's when I knew. She didn't have to say anything. The truth was written all over her face, but I needed to hear it from her, so I asked again, "Anna, just tell me the truth. Have you been unfaithful?" When she finally admitted it, it felt like the world stopped turning. She tried to explain, to tell me it wasn't what I thought, that it had just been a mistake, a moment of weakness, but I couldn't hear any of it. All I could think was, how could she do this? After everything we've been through, after all these years, how could she betray me like this? I felt this surge of anger and hurt rise up in me, and I didn't know what to do with it. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw something, to lash out, and make her feel just a fraction of the pain I was feeling. But another part of me felt completely numb, like I was outside of my own body, watching this unfold as if it were happening to someone else. We sat there for what felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. I honestly couldn't tell you. She kept trying to explain herself, but the words just washed over me. I couldn't focus on what she was saying, because all I could think about was the fact that the woman I had loved and trusted for so long had done this to me. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I got up from the table and just walked out of the room. I needed to be alone to process what I had just heard. I went to our bedroom, shut the door, and just sat there in the dark, trying to make sense of it all. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know if I could forgive her or if I even wanted to. All I knew was that everything had changed, and there was no going back to the way things were before. In the days that followed, I found myself in a place I never thought I'd be, completely lost. The house felt different, almost unfamiliar, as if everything had shifted just slightly out of place. I couldn't even look at Anna without feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite put into words. I knew I had to make a decision. Do I stay and try to work things out, or do I leave and start over? It seemed like such a simple question on the surface, but the more I thought about it, the more complicated it became. There were moments when I'd catch myself thinking about all the years we'd spent together, the good times, the laughter, the love we'd shared. How do you just walk away from a lifetime of memories? We'd built a life together, raised a family, and I couldn't imagine what it would be like to suddenly be without her. Part of me wanted to stay, to fight for what we had, to believe that we could somehow get through this. But then, there were the other moments, the moments when the anger would rise up inside me, when I'd remember the betrayal and feel like I couldn't breathe. How could I ever trust her again? How could I look at her without seeing the betrayal in her eyes? I knew that if I stayed, it wouldn't be the same. The trust that we'd spent decades building had been shattered, and I wasn't sure if it could ever be repaired. I started weighing the pros and cons, almost like I was making a list in my head. On one side, there was the life we'd built together, the comfort of familiarity, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move past this. On the other side, there was the pain, the betrayal, and the fear that staying would only lead to more heartache. Every time I thought I'd made up my mind, doubt would creep in, and I'd find myself back at square one. I'd go for long walks trying to clear my head, but the decision loomed over me like a dark cloud, always there, always pressing down on me. I talked to friends, sought advice from people I trusted, but in the end, it was clear that no one could make this decision for me. It was my life, my marriage, and my future at stake. There was a night, not long after the confrontation, when I found myself sitting alone in the living room. The house was quiet, and for the first time in days, I felt a strange sense of calm. I realized then that there wasn't going to be a right or wrong answer. No matter what I chose, it was going to hurt. There was no easy way out of this. But I also realized something else. I couldn't make this decision based on what was comfortable or familiar. I had to think about what was best for me, for my own well-being. I had to decide whether I could live with what had happened, whether I could truly forgive, or if it was time to let go and move on. In that moment, I felt a clarity that I hadn't felt since this whole nightmare began. I knew what I had to do. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick, but I knew I had to make a choice and stick to it. So, I made my decision. I decided to confront the reality of what had happened and choose a path forward. Whether that path would be with Anna or on my own, I wasn't entirely sure yet, but I knew I couldn't stay in limbo any longer. It was time to take the first step, whatever that step might be. After making the decision to confront what had happened, I realized I couldn't do it alone. I needed help, someone to talk to who could give me perspective, or at the very least, listen to me without judgment. That's when I started reaching out to the people who had always been there for me, my friends and family. The first person I called was my old friend, Mike. We'd been close for years, and he was the kind of guy who'd seen it all. When I told him what had happened, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could tell he was trying to find the right words, but instead of offering advice right away, he just listened. And that was exactly what I needed. I poured out everything. The shock, the anger, the confusion, the doubts that were eating me up inside. Mike didn't try to fix things or tell me what to do. He just let me talk, and that, in itself, was a huge relief. After a while, he started sharing some of his own experiences, stories I hadn't heard before about the struggles in his own marriage. It was comforting to know that I wasn't the only one who had faced something like this, and it made me feel a little less isolated in my pain. I also reached out to my sister, who had always been my rock. When I told her, she was furious. Not at me, but at the situation, at Anna, at the unfairness of it all. But underneath the anger, I could hear her concern. She didn't want to see me hurt, and she made it clear that whatever I decided to do, she would support me. Talking to her was different from talking to Mike. She was more protective, more emotional about it, and that helped in its own way. It reminded me that there were people in my life who cared deeply about me, who were invested in my happiness, and who would stand by me no matter what. Over the next few days, I reached out to a few more close friends. Each conversation was different. Some were more focused on practical advice, others were just a way to vent, but they all helped in one crucial way. They reminded me that I wasn't alone. I wasn't the only person to ever go through something like this, and I didn't have to face it by myself. I also started thinking about seeking professional help. I had never been to a therapist before, but I knew that I needed to talk to someone who could help me sort through the mess of emotions I was dealing with. I made an appointment and, although it felt strange at first to open up to a stranger, it turned out to be one of the best decisions I made during that time. The therapist helped me see things from a different perspective. She didn't have any emotional ties to the situation, so she could look at it objectively, helping me untangle the web of feelings that had been suffocating me. She didn't give me easy answers, but she helped me ask the right questions, and that made all the difference. Through all of this, I learned something important: the power of connection. It's easy to think you have to handle everything on your own, especially when you're used to being the one who holds it all together. But there's real strength in reaching out, in admitting that you need help, and in allowing others to be there for you. In the end, it wasn't just the advice or the comfort that helped me, it was knowing that I had people who cared, people who were willing to listen and support me, no matter how messy or complicated things got. It gave me the strength to keep going, to face the difficult days ahead, and to start the process of healing. After making the decision to confront what had happened, I realized I couldn't do it alone. I needed help, someone to talk to who could give me perspective, or at the very least, listen to me without judgment. That's when I started reaching out to the people who had always been there for me, my friends and family. The first person I called was my old friend, Mike. We'd been close for years, and he was the kind of guy who'd seen it all. When I told him what had happened, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could tell he was trying to find the right words, but instead of offering advice right away, he just listened. And that was exactly what I needed. I poured out everything: the shock, the anger, the confusion, the doubts that were eating me up inside. Mike didn't try to fix things or tell me what to do. He just let me talk, and that, in itself, was a huge relief. After a while, he started sharing some of his own experiences, stories I hadn't heard before about the struggles in his own marriage. It was comforting to know that I wasn't the only one who had faced something like this, and it made me feel a little less isolated in my pain. I also reached out to my sister, who had always been my rock. When I told her, she was furious. Not at me, but at the situation, at Anna, at the unfairness of it all. But underneath the anger, I could hear her concern. She didn't want to see me hurt, and she made it clear that whatever I decided to do, she would support me. Talking to her was different from talking to Mike. She was more protective, more emotional about it, and that helped in its own way. It reminded me that there were people in my life who cared deeply about me, who were invested in my happiness, and who would stand by me no matter what. Over the next few days, I reached out to a few more close friends. Each conversation was different. Some were more focused on practical advice, others were just a way to vent, but they all helped in one crucial way. They reminded me that I wasn't alone. I wasn't the only person to ever go through something like this, and I didn't have to face it by myself. I also started thinking about seeking professional help. I had never been to a therapist before, but I knew that I needed to talk to someone who could help me sort through the mess of emotions I was dealing with. I made an appointment, and, although it felt strange at first to open up to a stranger, it turned out to be one of the best decisions I made during that time. The therapist helped me see things from a different perspective. She didn't have any emotional ties to the situation, so she could look at it objectively, helping me untangle the web of feelings that had been suffocating me. She didn't give me easy answers, but she helped me ask the right questions, and that made all the difference. Through all of this, I learned something important: the power of connection. It's easy to think you have to handle everything on your own, especially when you're used to being the one who holds it all together. But there's real strength in reaching out, in admitting that you need help, and in allowing others to be there for you. In the end, it wasn't just the advice or the comfort that helped me, it was knowing that I had people who cared, people who were willing to listen and support me, no matter how messy or complicated things got. It gave me the strength to keep going, to face the difficult days ahead, and to start the process of healing. As I started to rebuild myself, I quickly learned that healing is far from a straight line. It's not a steady climb to the top where each day gets better than the last. No, it's more like a roller coaster, full of unexpected twists and turns, highs and lows, moments of hope, followed by plunges back into despair. One day, I'd wake up feeling almost like my old self again. I'd go about my day, find joy in little things, like a good cup of coffee or a chat with a friend, and I'd think to myself, maybe I'm finally getting past this. Those were the good days, the days when I felt like I was moving forward, when I could see a future that wasn't dominated by what had happened. But then, without warning, something would trigger a memory or a feeling, and I'd be right back at square one. I remember one afternoon, I was cleaning out the garage and came across an old photo album. Inside were pictures from a family vacation Anna and I took years ago, back when our kids were still young. Seeing those images, the smiles, the happiness we shared, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I sat there for what felt like hours, flipping through the pages, my heart aching with a mix of longing and sorrow. It was like I was mourning the loss of something I could never get back. On those days, the anger would resurface too. I'd find myself thinking about the betrayal, replaying it in my mind, and it would feel as raw as it did the first time I heard about it. The questions that had no answers would haunt me. Why did she do it? Was it something I did or didn't do? And most painfully, could it have been avoided? It was exhausting, and it felt like I was stuck in a loop, unable to break free from the past. And then there was the guilt. Guilt for not being able to just move on. Guilt for feeling anger towards someone I had loved for so long. Guilt for the times I thought about leaving. And guilt for the moments when I still missed her, despite everything. I knew it didn't make sense, but emotions rarely do. They're messy and complicated, and they don't follow any logical pattern. What I came to realize during this time was that it was okay to have these ups and downs. It was okay to have days where I felt strong and days where I felt like I was falling apart. Healing wasn't something I could rush or force. It was something I had to let happen naturally, in its own time. There were days when I questioned whether I would ever truly heal, whether I would ever find peace with what had happened. But slowly, I started to accept that these feelings were part of the process. The ups and downs, the emotional roller coaster, they weren't signs that I was failing to move on. They were signs that I was human, that I was feeling, processing, and ultimately healing in the way I needed to. One thing that helped was learning to be kinder to myself. Instead of getting frustrated when I had a bad day, I started to accept it as part of the journey. I allowed myself to feel the pain, the sadness, the anger, without judgment. And when the better days came, I tried to embrace them without fear of the next downturn. Over time, I noticed that the good days started to outnumber the bad. The lows weren't as deep or as long-lasting as they had been in the beginning. The roller coaster was still there, but it wasn't as wild, and I was getting better at riding it out, knowing that no matter how low I felt, I would eventually rise again. This part of the journey taught me that healing is not about reaching a place where you never feel pain again. It's about learning to live with that pain, to navigate through it, and to find moments of peace and joy amidst the turmoil. It's about understanding that the roller coaster of emotions is normal, and that with time, the ride becomes less terrifying and more manageable. As time went on, I began to find a new rhythm in my life. The roller coaster of emotions still had its twists and turns, but I was starting to feel more like myself again. The wounds were still there, but they were beginning to heal. I wasn't looking for anything new, especially not love. I didn't think I was ready for that. But life has a funny way of surprising you when you least expect it. It was at a friend's gathering, a casual barbecue on a sunny afternoon. I almost didn't go, thinking it would be easier to just stay home and avoid the questions and concerned looks from people who knew what I'd been through. But something in me knew that I needed to get out, to start engaging with the world again. So I went. That's where I met Lola. She wasn't someone I had ever expected to meet. She was warm, with a genuine smile and a kind, easygoing way about her. We were introduced by a mutual friend, and I remember thinking how refreshing it was to talk to someone without any history, without any baggage between us. It was just simple. We started chatting about the usual things: work, hobbies, life, and before I knew it, we were laughing together like old friends. I didn't think much of it at first. I wasn't looking for anything, and I wasn't even sure if I could ever open up to someone again. But there was something about Lola that made me feel comfortable, at ease in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. She had a lightness about her, a positivity that was contagious, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of hope. We exchanged numbers, and over the next few weeks, we kept in touch. It started with casual texts, then phone calls, and eventually, we met up for coffee. Each time we talked, I felt a little more of the weight I'd been carrying start to lift. Lola wasn't trying to fix me or rush me into anything. She just listened, shared her own stories, and made me laugh a lot. It was something I hadn't realized I needed so much. As we spent more time together, I started to feel something I hadn't expected: an attraction, a curiosity about what could be. It scared me, honestly. I was still healing, still trying to make sense of everything that had happened with Anna. But there was something undeniable about the connection I felt with Lola. It was different from anything I'd experienced before. Gentler, slower, but also deeper in a way that I couldn't quite explain. One evening, we were sitting in a quiet cafe, just talking as we usually did. She was telling me about a funny incident at work, and I found myself just watching her, noticing the way her eyes lit up when she laughed, the warmth in her voice. That's when it hit me. This was something real, something that, despite my fears, I wanted to explore. But with that realization came all the doubts and fears that had been lurking in the back of my mind. Could I really trust someone again? Was I ready to open my heart after everything that had happened? I didn't want to bring my past into this new connection, but I also didn't want to ignore the scars that were still there. Lola must have sensed my hesitation because, without me saying a word, she reached across the table and took my hand. "Andrew," she said softly, "you don't have to rush anything. Let's just take things one day at a time. We'll see where this goes, and whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." Her words were exactly what I needed to hear. She wasn't asking for promises or commitments, just for a chance to see where this might lead. It was the first time in a long time that I felt like I didn't have to have all the answers, that it was okay to just be in the moment, to let things unfold naturally. As we left the cafe that night, I felt a mix of emotions: excitement, hope, but also a healthy dose of caution. I knew I was stepping into something new, something that had the potential to change my life again. But this time, it felt different. This time, I felt like I had the strength to handle whatever came next. Meeting Lola was the spark of something new. something I wasn't sure I would ever feel again. It didn't erase the past or the pain, but it showed me that there was still a future, still a possibility for happiness and love. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to see where that future might take me. As my connection with Lola deepened, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Happiness. Real, unburdened happiness. It was a strange feeling at first, almost unfamiliar after everything I had been through. But with each passing day, I began to realize that it was possible to find joy again, to create new memories that weren't overshadowed by the past. Lola and I continued to take things slow, which was exactly what I needed. There was no rush, no pressure to define what we were or where we were headed. We just enjoyed each other's company, one day at a time. Whether it was a walk in the park, a quiet dinner at home, or a simple conversation over coffee, every moment felt easy, natural, and real. One of the most surprising things about this new relationship was how different it felt from anything I had experienced before. With Lola, there was a lightness, a sense of freedom that I hadn't known in years. It wasn't that the pain of the past had completely disappeared. It was still there, lingering in the background, but it no longer defined me. I was learning to live with it, to let it be part of my story, without letting it control my future. Lola had a way of bringing out the best in me. She encouraged me to pursue my interests, to reconnect with the things that made me happy. She didn't try to change me or push me in any particular direction. She just supported me in whatever way I needed. It was a kind of love that was gentle, patient, and understanding, exactly what I needed to heal. As the months went by, I found myself looking forward to our time together more and more. I started to let my guard down, to trust in the possibility that this new chapter of my life could be just as fulfilling, if not more so, than what I had before. It wasn't about replacing the past, but about building something new on the foundation of what I had learned and experienced. We began to talk about the future, not in grand, sweeping terms, but in small, meaningful ways. What our next weekend together might look like, or a trip we wanted to take in the summer. These conversations felt different, though. They weren't filled with the weight of expectation or the pressure of making up for lost time. They were simply about enjoying what we had and looking forward to what might come next. I remember one evening in particular that stands out as a turning point. We were sitting on my back porch, watching the sun set. The sky was painted with soft shades of pink and orange, and there was a peaceful silence between us. Lola turned to me and said, "You know, Andrew, I'm really happy right now, just being here, with you." Her words struck a chord deep within me. It wasn't just that she was happy, it was that I was too. In that moment, I realized that I had found something I never thought I would find again. A new kind of love, one that was born out of the ashes of the past, but wasn't burdened by it. I looked at her and replied, "I'm happy too, Lola. More than I've been in a long time." And I meant it. I was genuinely happy. Not because everything in my life was perfect, far from it, but because I had found someone who accepted me for who I was, scars and all. Someone who didn't need me to be anything other than myself. This new happiness didn't erase the past or the pain I had gone through, but it did make me realize that there was life after heartbreak, there was love after loss, and there was hope even after everything I had been through. Lola and I continued to build our relationship, one day at a time. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments when the old fears and doubts would creep back in. But with Lola, I felt like I had the strength to face those fears and move forward. Together, we were creating something beautiful, something that felt like a fresh start, a new beginning that was entirely our own. In discovering this new love, I also discovered something about myself, that I was capable of healing, of finding joy again, and of opening my heart to the possibilities of the future. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was a life worth living, a life filled with love, happiness, and the promise of new beginnings. As I reflect on everything that has happened, from the moment I first learned of Anna's betrayal to finding new love with Lola, I realize how much I've changed. The journey hasn't been easy. Far from it. There were times when I didn't think I'd make it through, when the pain and the uncertainty felt overwhelming. But now, standing on the other side, I can see that every step, every challenge, and every emotional high and low has brought me to where I am today. With Lola, I've found a new beginning, a fresh start that I never thought was possible. She's shown me that love can be kind, gentle, and patient, that it doesn't have to be perfect to be real. Through her, I've learned to trust again, not just in another person, but in myself, in my ability to heal, to grow, and to open my heart to new possibilities. But perhaps the most important lesson I've learned is that happiness isn't about holding on to the things we think we need. It's about embracing what we have here and now. It's about finding joy in the small moments, the quiet evenings, the shared laughter, and the simple act of being with someone who cares about you just as you are. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it brings you some comfort, some hope, or at least the knowledge that you're not alone. We're all on this journey together, and I'm grateful to have had the chance to share mine with you.